A millionaire CEO dialed a cleaning lady to fire her, only to hear a little girl whisper 4 words that shattered his world. Ryan Holden always began his mornings the same way, with the crisp efficiency of a man who believed that predictability was the foundation of success. By 7:30, he was in his office on the top floor of the glass tower that bore his company's name, seated behind a polished mahogany desk that had witnessed hundreds of deals and decisions. He liked that the floor-to-ceiling windows made the city look small and manageable, a silent reminder that he was the one in control of his own life and the empire he had built. Dressed in a perfectly cut blue suit that had cost more than most people's rent, with every hair smoothed neatly into place, he looked exactly as he intended to. Untouchable, competent, and too busy for anything but results. This morning, he was reviewing a presentation about a potential merger, making precise notes in the margins while his assistant quietly stacked a fresh pile of documents at the edge of the desk. Ryan didn't look up. He rarely needed to. His employees had learned long ago that he valued silence and competence above all else. He was already thinking about how he would open the afternoon's board meeting, rehearsing the sentences in his mind, when the assistant hesitated just long enough to break his concentration. When Ryan finally lifted his gaze, the young man was standing with his hands clasped, looking uneasy. That alone was enough to irritate him. He disliked any disruption to his routine, especially on days packed with important deadlines. He arched an eyebrow, silently demanding an explanation. "Sir," the assistant began carefully, "I'm sorry to bother you with something this minor, but it appears Mrs. Brown, the cleaning woman assigned to this floor, hasn't come in for the second day in a row." Ryan suppressed a sigh. In the scope of his responsibilities, billions in revenue, hundreds of employees, a reputation that could not afford blemishes, this was hardly worth a minute of his attention. Still, he disliked the idea that anyone in his building thought attendance was optional. He'd built his entire career on the principle that reliability mattered more than talent. "Did she call in?" he asked, his tone clipped but calm. "No, sir," the assistant said, shifting uncomfortably. "And I thought you would want to decide whether we should terminate her contract." Ryan closed his folder with a soft click and leaned back in his chair. Part of him wanted to dismiss it with a wave of his hand. He had never met Mrs. Brown in person. She was simply part of the invisible machinery that kept his office spotless. But another part of him, a quieter voice he usually ignored, wondered why someone who had never missed a day before would suddenly vanish without explanation. He didn't particularly care about her reasons, but he did care about the precedent it would set if no one asked. "Give me her phone number," he said finally. The assistant looked surprised, but handed over the slip of paper with a nervous nod. Ryan turned the paper between his fingers for a moment, studying the neat script of the digits. Then he picked up the phone, feeling nothing but mild annoyance that this small problem was interrupting the order of his morning. As he dialed, he told himself this would take no more than a minute. He would demand an explanation, issue a warning, and move on to something more worthy of his time. He waited as the line rang, already preparing exactly what he would say in the firm, impersonal tone he reserved for people who failed to meet expectations. When the call finally connected, he did not hear the tired voice of an adult woman. Instead, a small, uncertain voice came through the line, so soft he almost thought he'd misheard it. "Hello?" For a few seconds, he was too startled to answer. Ryan Holden always believed that the key to staying in control was to start every day with absolute order. Even the smallest details mattered. That morning, like every morning, he arrived at his office before most of the city was awake. The elevator doors slid open silently on the top floor, revealing a corridor lined with glass walls and framed photographs of construction sites he had turned into landmarks. He walked past them without a glance, focused entirely on his schedule. His steps were precise and unhurried, his mind already reviewing the bullet points he planned to emphasize in the afternoon's investor call. He was dressed in a tailored blue suit that announced both success and a kind of careful distance. Everything about him, from the crisp line of his tie to the polished leather of his shoes, had been chosen to remind people that he had no time for mistakes, excuses, or unpredictability. His office was large and bright, flooded with the cool light of an overcast morning. The windows offered a sweeping view of the skyline, but Ryan rarely looked at it for more than a moment. He preferred to keep his attention on the work in front of him. He set his briefcase down on the corner of his desk and glanced at the stack of reports neatly arranged by his assistant. Each document had a color-coded tab. Each section was marked for review. It was exactly the way he liked it. He sat, opened the first folder, and began to read without even removing his coat. 15 minutes passed before he realized someone was standing in the doorway, waiting. He looked up slowly, expecting to see his head of finance or perhaps the executive assistant who managed his calls. Instead, it was Peter, the young secretary who had started only a few months ago and still looked vaguely terrified whenever Ryan addressed him. Peter held a slim tablet against his chest like a shield and shifted his weight from foot to foot. The sight annoyed Ryan more than the interruption itself. He disliked when people brought him problems without first trying to solve them. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with impatience. Peter cleared his throat and took a cautious step forward. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. It's about the cleaning staff. Mrs. Brown hasn't reported for her shift again today." He paused, as if hoping Ryan might wave the matter away. But Ryan only narrowed his eyes slightly. Peter swallowed. "This is the second day in a row." Ryan drummed his fingers once against the desk, thinking. Mrs. Brown. He couldn't picture her face. She was one of dozens of employees he had never met in person, a name on a roster, a quiet presence he never noticed unless something went wrong. He disliked that he now knew her only because she had failed to appear. "Did she call in sick?" "No, sir," Peter said, and there was something in the way he glanced down at the tablet that made Ryan suspect he was already anticipating the order to terminate her employment. That would have been the simplest solution. Ryan didn't tolerate unreliability. Still, a thought he couldn't quite define made him pause. He didn't know why he cared enough to ask another question. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the faint unease that came from any disruption to the order he prized so much. "Give me her number," he said at last. "I'll call her myself." Peter's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he obeyed without comment, tapping the screen and copying the number onto a small slip of paper. Ryan waited until the door closed behind him before he picked it up. He read the digits slowly, wondering why this felt like more than an inconvenience. He reminded himself that this was nothing but a routine problem, an absent employee, a conversation to set expectations, a formality. He picked up the phone and dialed, rehearsing in his mind the firm, composed words he would use. The line rang 3 times, then 4, and he felt the first faint stir of irritation. When he finally heard the click of someone picking up, he didn't wait for a greeting. "Mrs. Brown," he began, his tone already crisp with reproof. "This is Ryan Holden. I'd like to know why you—" But the voice that interrupted him wasn't tired or apologetic or defensive. It was small, high, and tentative in a way that made every practiced phrase vanish from his mind. "Hello?" the little voice said, so quietly he almost thought he imagined it. For the first time in years, Ryan Holden was completely unprepared to answer. For a moment, Ryan could not find any words at all. The little voice on the other end of the line was so gentle and unsteady that it hardly seemed real. It carried none of the practiced submission he had come to expect from employees who feared disappointing him. None of the defensive defiance he sometimes heard from people who refused to own their failures. It was simply the voice of a child who sounded as if she had been waiting a long time for someone to speak. He cleared his throat, trying to collect the pieces of his carefully rehearsed reprimand, but they no longer made sense. This was supposed to be a short call, a matter of discipline and procedure, not something that felt suddenly delicate and personal. "Hello?" he said finally, and he heard how strange his own voice sounded. Too low, too sharp against her softness. He tried again, softer this time. "Can I speak to your mother?" There was a pause, and he could almost picture her holding the phone in both small hands, wondering if she had done something wrong by answering. When she spoke again, her words came out in a single breath, as though she had been practicing them for hours and was afraid she might forget if she didn't hurry. "Mommy can't talk right now," she whispered. She's really sick." Something in Ryan's chest went tight, a sensation so unfamiliar he almost mistook it for anger. But it wasn't anger. It was the cold clarity of understanding that in all the hours he had spent chasing perfection, he had never once considered the possibility that someone's absence might be something other than negligence. He rubbed his forehead and forced himself to stay calm. He knew how to handle crises. He had mediated mergers that affected thousands of employees. But he had never been on the phone with a child who sounded so small and so heartbreakingly resolute. "What's your name?" he asked, because it was the only thing that felt appropriate to say. "Mia," she said, almost too quietly for him to hear. "I'm 6. There was another pause. He waited, willing himself not to fill the silence with the wrong words. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. "Mommy said she has to work, but she can't get up. I can come instead if you need someone to clean." He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing the heel of his hand to the center of his forehead. The idea of a little girl standing on tiptoe to reach the cleaning supplies was so vivid it made him feel unsteady. He drew in a slow breath. "No," he said, as gently as he could manage. "No, Mia. That's very brave of you to say, but you don't have to do that." "But we need money," she said, and in those 4 words, he heard more honesty than in any meeting he'd ever attended. He thought about all the times he had cut costs without thinking of whose lives he was affecting. All the times he had believed that discipline mattered more than understanding. He felt the heat of shame creep up the back of his neck. He had been ready to fire a woman he had never met because she had failed to appear for 2 shifts, never imagining there might be a little girl waiting behind a door for her mother to get better. "I'm sorry," he said, and he wasn't even sure if he was apologizing to Mia or to someone else, maybe to himself. "I shouldn't have raised my voice." "It's okay," she whispered, but it wasn't okay, and they both knew it. He swallowed, searching for something to say that would not sound hollow. He had spent his whole life cultivating the image of a man who never faltered, never doubted, never allowed himself to feel more than necessary. But in that moment, listening to Mia's uneven breathing, he felt every one of his defenses crumble. "Will you tell your mother that she doesn't have to worry about work right now?" he managed at last. And that I hope she feels better very soon." "Yes," Mia said softly. He thought he heard the tiniest exhale, like she was relieved that someone had finally acknowledged what she had been carrying alone. He hesitated, wanting to ask if she needed anything, but before he could speak again, the line went quiet. She had hung up. He sat there for a long time, the phone still in his hand, staring at the papers he had been ready to sign without a second thought. Nothing on his desk seemed important anymore. He set the receiver down slowly and leaned back in his chair, feeling something inside him shift. He knew then that he wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. For the first time in years, he felt certain that the right thing to do wasn't the efficient choice, but the compassionate one. Ryan didn't move for what felt like several minutes after Mia hung up the phone. He sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the smooth surface of his desk, feeling the polished wood cool against his skin. Outside the window, the sky had shifted from dull grey to something closer to pale blue, but he barely noticed. He could not stop hearing the small, determined voice saying, "I can come instead if you need someone to clean." The quiet courage it must have taken for a child to offer that solution carved through all the walls he had built around himself. For so long, he had measured people by what they delivered, by how they contributed to the smooth operation of his world. But now, he couldn't stop thinking of a little girl standing by a sickbed, clutching the phone with both hands, hoping she had done the right thing by answering. He pushed back his chair and stood, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off the heaviness pressing down on them. It didn't work. The weight remained, lodged deep in his chest. He knew he could ask someone from HR to handle this, to call social services or arrange for sick leave to be filed properly. That would have been efficient. It would have been professional. But the thought of delegating felt cowardly, a way to avoid facing the human cost of the choices he made every day. He had never considered himself a cruel man, but he had learned to be detached. He told himself it was necessary if he wanted to stay sharp and decisive. Now he wondered if that detachment had become something smaller, meaner, something that made it too easy to forget what it meant to have a life beyond the walls of his office. He reached for his phone again, this time to call his assistant. Peter picked up immediately, his voice anxious. "Yes, sir?" Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tension in his chest left no room for impatience. "Cancel the rest of my appointments today. Reschedule everything for tomorrow." There was a moment of silence, and he could practically hear Peter wondering if he had misunderstood. Ryan had never once in all the years at the company cancelled an entire day's work without a crisis. "Sir, should I—" Peter began, but Ryan cut him off gently. "No, just reschedule. I'll be out of the building for the rest of the day." He hung up before any more questions could come. Moving on instinct more than any plan, he pulled on his coat and left the office without another word to anyone. The elevator ride felt endless. He stood alone, watching the floor numbers tick down, feeling each one as another small step away from the version of himself who would have told a little girl that her mother's absence was simply a problem to be solved. By the time he reached the lobby, he knew exactly where he was going, even if he still wasn't sure what he would say when he got there. He drove himself, declining the company car that usually ferried him between meetings. He didn't want anyone else involved. He needed to see it with his own eyes, to understand why Mia's voice had affected him so completely. The neighborhood was on the edge of the city, where the buildings were older and the sidewalks cracked from too many winters without repairs. He parked in front of a narrow brick apartment block with peeling paint around the windows. For a moment he sat in the car, his hands still on the steering wheel, feeling strangely like an intruder. He didn't belong here. He had spent his life making sure he would never belong anywhere like this. Yet here he was. When he climbed the steps, he had to stop to read the numbers on the doors because none of them had clear markings. The hallway smelled faintly of old coffee and detergent, and something about that simple detail made his chest ache in a way he couldn't name. He found the right door and stood there, uncertain for the first time in years how to announce himself. His knuckles hovered over the wood, but he didn't knock immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, willing himself to set aside every instinct to lecture or to fix. He needed to be something else today. Someone else. At last, he tapped gently, listening for movement on the other side. He heard nothing at first. Then came the sound of soft footsteps, so light he knew it had to be Mia. The door opened a few inches, and she peered up at him, her blue eyes enormous in her small, pale face. She was wearing a pink dress with a little bow at the collar, and her blonde curls were held back by a faded headband. For a second, neither of them spoke. He realized he must look strange to her, this tall man in a crisp suit standing outside her door without any clear reason. She tilted her head just a little, her gaze cautious but curious. "You're the man from Mommy's work?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been on the phone. He felt something in his chest twist. "Yes," he said, and he was surprised by how unsteady his voice sounded. "My name is Ryan. May I come in?" Mia looked over her shoulder as if checking to see if her mother would object, but there was no reply from inside the apartment. After a moment, she stepped back and pulled the door open wider. He stepped over the threshold, feeling the smallest hands brush his coat as she moved aside for him. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of tea and something floral he couldn't place. The apartment was small but tidy, and in the corner he saw the narrow bed where a woman lay propped up on thin pillows. Mrs. Brown's face was even paler than he'd imagined, her features drawn tight with exhaustion and pain. She turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes wary, though she tried to smooth her expression into something like politeness. "Mr. Holden," she said, her voice no stronger than a whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't expect you to come." He took one slow step closer and stopped at the end of the bed, feeling completely unprepared for how small she looked. For a moment, all the speeches he might have given disappeared, and all that remained was the simple truth that he was here because he could not bear the thought of Mia trying to carry the world alone. Ryan stood there in the small living room, feeling more like a trespasser than the man who signed hundreds of paychecks every month. He had walked into countless offices, boardrooms, and conference halls without a second of hesitation. But here, in this dim apartment, with its threadbare rug and the faint smell of menthol ointment in the air, he felt the edges of his composure begin to fray. Mrs. Brown's frail hands were folded over the blanket that covered her thin body, and she lifted them with effort, as if she meant to smooth her hair or adjust her pillow, but hadn't the strength to complete the gesture. He was struck by the smallness of everything about her: her wrists, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the soft, apologetic way she looked at him as though she was the one who had done something wrong. He cleared his throat, not because he needed to speak, but because he needed a moment to steady himself. He had spent so many years building a reputation as someone who never wavered, who never let sentiment interfere with decisions. But standing here, none of that felt like something worth preserving. Mia hovered near her mother's side, one hand resting lightly on the bed frame, watching Ryan with a solemnity that seemed too heavy for a child her age. He wanted to say something reassuring to her, something that would lift the worry from her small face. But his mind was a blank canvas, wiped clean of all the polished phrases he normally used to manage difficult conversations. "I wanted to check on you," he managed at last, and his own voice startled him with how unfamiliar it sounded. "When no one heard from you, I thought it was important to see for myself." He was aware that he was gripping the back of a chair for balance, that his palms were damp. Mrs. Brown closed her eyes briefly, her breath catching in her throat before she spoke again. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she said in a voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear. "I thought if I could just rest a few days, I'd be able to come back and no one would have to know." She opened her eyes and looked up at him, her gaze full of a quiet despair that made him feel hollow. "But I can't even stand for more than a minute. I don't know what we'll do." Ryan glanced at Mia, who shifted a little, as though bracing for some scolding or judgment. Instead, he pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, ignoring the way his suit creased. It didn't matter here. None of the old symbols of status or control mattered. He folded his hands carefully in his lap, trying to think of how to explain that he hadn't come to reprimand them. He studied Mrs. Brown's face, the way her eyes flickered toward Mia every few seconds, as though she was more worried for her daughter's feelings than her own failing health. "Mia told me you were sick," he said finally, and he saw the way her shoulders seemed to contract under the blanket, as if she was ashamed to have burdened her daughter with that truth. "I'm sorry I raised my voice," he continued, aware of how inadequate the words were. "I didn't understand what was happening." "You didn't have to come," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know you're very busy. I don't expect—" "But I did come," he interrupted quietly, and the finality in his tone surprised even him. He turned to Mia, who stood very still, her eyes wide. "And I'm glad I did." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He glanced around, noticing how carefully everything had been cleaned despite Mrs. Brown's weakness. Folded laundry stacked neatly in a basket, a row of washed cups drying by the sink. It was the kind of ordinary order that spoke of someone who had spent her life taking care of others without ever expecting help in return. He felt a strange ache in his chest at the thought that she had tried to keep working, even when she could barely get out of bed, simply because she believed no one would care enough to ask why she was missing. He turned back to her, his voice firmer now. "You don't need to worry about your job," he said, choosing each word carefully so she would hear the seriousness in them. "You will have the time you need to get well, and I'll make sure you have what you need in the meantime." Her lips parted as though she was about to protest, but she only managed a small exhale before her eyes filled with tears. She looked down, blinking rapidly, but she couldn't stop them from sliding down her cheeks. Mia moved closer and reached for her mother's hand, her tiny fingers curling around her mother's limp ones. Ryan's gaze dropped to that fragile connection between them, and something settled in him, a quiet, undeniable conviction that he would not walk away from this. When Mrs. Brown finally looked up again, her voice was hoarse. "I don't want charity," she said, though it came out as more of a plea than a refusal. He shook his head gently. "It's not charity," he answered. "It's the least I can do. No one should have to face something like this alone." Mia's eyes lifted to meet his, searching his face for any sign that he was lying. He held her gaze steadily, and after a moment, she leaned her cheek against her mother's shoulder, her expression softening. The trust in that small gesture made something in him tighten, and he had to look away, clearing his throat again. He realized he had never felt so sure of anything in his life as he was of this. He could not pretend anymore that this was just a problem to be delegated or forgotten. He had come here to do the right thing, but now he understood that this was only the beginning. Ryan stayed longer than he intended, long enough that the light in the small living room shifted from the weak gray of morning to the softer, golden slant of afternoon. He found himself forgetting the clock altogether, forgetting the dozens of emails piling up on his phone, the meetings he was supposed to be leading. None of it felt important here. He hadn't come with a plan, but he discovered quickly that plans had never mattered less to him than they did now. He just needed to understand what this little family had been going through, to see it for himself instead of imagining it as a line item on a report. He asked simple questions, careful to keep his voice calm, and listened as Mrs. Brown explained, haltingly, how the sickness had crept up on her over the winter, how she had kept going as long as she could because she was terrified of losing her job and the small security it brought them. She told him about the week she could hardly stand, but still insisted on working until she collapsed one evening in the hallway. Even as she spoke, she kept glancing at Mia as if to measure how much her daughter could stand to hear. He realized how much effort it cost her to pretend that everything would be fine, how she had tried to shield Mia from the worst of it, even though Mia was clearly old enough to sense the truth. He watched the little girl's face as she listened. Her expression did not change much, but her hand never left her mother's arm. It struck him then that this child had learned to be braver than she should ever have needed to be. He felt it like a stone in his chest. After a while, Mrs. Brown's voice grew fainter, and she closed her eyes. Mia reached for a glass of water on the side table and held it out with both hands. Ryan rose to help, steadying the cup as Mrs. Brown took a sip. When she rested back against the pillow, her breathing sounded easier. She opened her eyes again, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I get tired so quickly." "You don't have to apologize," he said, and he meant it with a depth he hadn't anticipated. "You don't owe me any explanations." Mia seemed to study him then, her blue eyes searching his face with a focus that made him feel unexpectedly exposed. He wondered if she was trying to decide whether he could be trusted, or if he was just another adult who would disappear when things became inconvenient. He knew that look because, in a way, he'd seen it on the faces of people who had once depended on him. Employees who believed his promises, investors who believed his assurances. He had learned to harden himself to disappointment, but somehow he couldn't bear the idea of her doing the same. He glanced around the room, taking in the tidy stacks of folded clothes, the little shelf crowded with children's books, the lone vase of wilted daisies on the table. Everything here was an effort to create some semblance of normalcy, despite how fragile their circumstances were. He looked back at Mia. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. She nodded. "How are you doing?" It was such a simple question, but it made her eyebrows knit together in surprise, as though no one had thought to ask her that in a long time. She hesitated, her lips parting, and then she shrugged, her shoulders rising and falling in a tiny gesture of surrender. "I'm okay," she whispered, but her voice sounded older than it should have, and something about it made his throat feel tight. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm going to help your mom," he said, and he realized as he spoke that this wasn't just an offer. It was a commitment he already knew he would keep. "She won't have to worry about her job or money for now, and you won't have to worry about her getting sicker because she has to work." Mia blinked at him, her eyes wide. "You can do that?" she asked, her voice small. He nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "I can." She didn't smile exactly, but she let out a long, slow breath, as though she had been holding it for days. She turned to look at her mother, who was watching them with an exhausted kind of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe she was no longer alone in this fight. For a long time, no one spoke. The quiet felt different now, less like something heavy and more like the cautious beginning of relief. Ryan sat back and let himself exhale. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ryan left their apartment only when he could no longer ignore the darkening sky pressing against the windows. The city outside looked blurred and cold compared to the warmth he'd felt in that small living room. And for the first time in his adult life, he found himself reluctant to return to his own immaculate penthouse where no one waited for him. As he walked down the narrow stairwell, he replayed every word Mia and her mother had spoken, feeling each detail settle deeper under his skin. By the time he reached his car, he knew there was no going back to the way he had been before. He couldn't pretend he cared only out of obligation. He had crossed an invisible line the moment he sat beside Mrs. Brown's bed, and he no longer wanted to step away. When he got home, he didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he sat in the silent darkness, with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen as if it could tell him what to do next. He thought about the look in Mia's eyes when she asked if he could really help them, about the relief in her mother's voice when she finally believed he meant it. He thought about how easily he had dismissed thousands of people's private struggles in the past as someone else's responsibility. It was harder now to see those decisions as purely professional. He had always believed that success demanded distance, but tonight he felt the emptiness of that distance more acutely than ever before. He didn't sleep much. When dawn came, he was already at his desk, drafting a list of practical steps, arranging a specialist to visit Mrs. Brown, setting up a grocery delivery schedule, and authorizing an advance payment into her account so she wouldn't have to think about bills. He called Margaret, the company's attorney who had worked with him for over a decade, and explained the situation. She listened in the same calm, unflappable way she always did, but there was a pause when he finished describing how he had found Mia alone in the apartment answering the phone. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than he expected. "Ryan, this isn't your responsibility," she said carefully. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the familiar ache of too many hours awake. "I know it isn't," he said, "but it feels like it is." He heard her exhale as though she was weighing whether to challenge him. "All right," she said finally. "Then we'll make sure everything is arranged properly." By the time he ended the call, he felt a measure of relief, a sense that he was not alone in trying to untangle the practical realities from the emotions he didn't fully understand yet. Later that morning, he drove back to their building without thinking too hard about how unusual it was. He carried a bag of groceries himself because it felt wrong to send an assistant. When he knocked this time, Mia opened the door with a look of shy expectation, her hand twisting the hem of her pink dress. He noticed she had combed her curls more carefully and that she was wearing clean white socks pulled up to her knees, as if she had prepared for him to see her. Her mother was awake, propped on more pillows than the day before. She looked stronger, though still pale, and when she saw him standing there with the bag in his arms, her eyes filled with tears, she quickly tried to blink away. He set the groceries on the counter and sat down without waiting to be invited. It felt Brown missed working because it made her feel useful. He listened more than he spoke, careful not to let any impatience show when Mrs. Brown apologized again and again for needing help. He tried to explain that he didn't see it as charity, that it was simply what any decent person would do if they had the means. But even as he said it, he knew it was more complicated. There was something personal in this, something he hadn't quite admitted to himself. At one point, Mia climbed onto the couch beside him, sitting so close her shoulder brushed his arm. She didn't say anything, but he felt the quiet trust in that simple act. He glanced down at her and saw that she was studying the cuff of his jacket as if she'd never seen a suit up close. Her mother noticed too, her lips curving in a tired, wondering smile. "She's been talking about you," she murmured. "I think she's decided you're safe." He swallowed, struck by how much that meant coming from a child who had learned to be careful with hope. By the time he left again, he had arranged for a home nurse to visit and made sure they had everything they needed for the next week. He paused at the door, one hand braced on the frame, feeling a strange reluctance to step back into the hallway. Mia came to stand in front of him, lifting her face to look up into his. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice so soft he almost had to lean down to hear. He didn't let himself hesitate. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll come back." When she nodded and stepped back, he realized how easy it would be to keep that promise, and how impossible it would feel to ever break it. The following week passed in a way that felt strangely suspended between two worlds. During the day, Ryan returned to the familiar grind of meetings, contract reviews, and conference calls that usually gave him a sense of purpose. He would sit at the long boardroom table while executives presented their projections in confident voices, nodding at all the appropriate intervals. But inwardly, he was somewhere else entirely. Even as he signed off on multi-million-dollar decisions, he kept thinking of the small apartment with its mismatched chairs and the quiet dignity with which Mrs. Brown tried to thank him for every small gesture. He thought of Mia, whose trust had seemed to grow with every visit, and how she had begun waiting by the door when she knew he was coming. Each evening, he returned home with a mind crowded by their faces and a heart that felt heavier and fuller all at once. He tried to tell himself this was temporary, a short-term commitment to help them get back on their feet. But even as he repeated it, he knew he was lying. There was nothing temporary about the way he felt when he stepped across their threshold and heard Mia's delighted, "Hi!" or when Mrs. Brown looked at him as though she could not believe anyone would care so consistently. He had spent most of his adult life building barriers to keep people at a safe distance. It had never occurred to him that one day he might want to let someone in. He began to make small rituals of his visits. On Mondays, he brought fresh groceries. On Thursdays, he brought children's books he thought Mia might enjoy. On Saturday mornings, he picked up pastries from a little bakery on the corner and carried them in a brown paper bag, feeling something unfamiliar and warm whenever Mia clapped her hands in excitement at the sight. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, sometimes longer. He would sit on the couch with a cup of tea that Mrs. Brown insisted on making herself as soon as she was strong enough, and they would talk about things that had nothing to do with illness or hardship. She asked about his life, questions no one else ever seemed to care about. And when he told her about his parents, about how he had grown up without much and worked for everything he had, she listened in a way that made him feel seen rather than evaluated. One evening, as dusk turned the windows into dark mirrors, Mia crawled onto the couch beside him with a coloring book. She opened it to a blank page and held out a pink crayon, her brows drawing together in determination. "You can color with me?" she said, as though it were an obvious invitation, and he smiled because he couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him to do something so simple. He accepted the crayon and filled in the outline of a flower while she watched approvingly. When they finished, she studied the page and declared it perfect. He was startled by how much pride he felt over a child's praise. That same night, Mrs. Brown waited until Mia had gone to the bedroom to put away her drawings before she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You've already done more than anyone could expect," she said, her eyes searching his face as if she needed to understand his motives. "I keep thinking you'll decide you've done enough and that you'll stop coming." For a moment, he couldn't answer. He had been asking himself the same question late at night. Why he kept going back, why it mattered so much. But when he tried to imagine stepping away, to picture letting them become a memory he might recall once in a while without obligation, he felt a cold finality he couldn't accept. He shook his head slowly. "I won't stop," he said, and the conviction in his own voice surprised him. "As long as you'll let me be here." Mrs. Brown's gaze softened. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "It's been a long time since anyone has meant that," she admitted. He felt a deep, quiet ache in his chest as he watched her struggle to accept help without feeling diminished. He wished there was something he could say that would make her believe she deserved it simply because she was trying so hard to hold everything together. After that night, the way they spoke to each other changed. There was less formality, fewer cautious silences. He began to feel something he hadn't realized he missed: belonging. When he arrived, Mia would launch herself into his arms without hesitation. And when he left, Mrs. Brown would stand in the doorway, her hand lifted in a small wave that felt more genuine than any of the hundreds of polite goodbyes he heard in his office each week. One morning, as he stood in the kitchen arranging the groceries he'd brought, he realized that this tiny, imperfect home had become the one place where he didn't feel like he had to perform some version of himself. There was no role to inhabit here, no expectations he needed to outdo. He could simply be a man trying to do what was right for a family that had somehow become part of his life. And though he hadn't spoken it out loud yet, he was beginning to understand that he didn't want that to change. The day Ryan finally admitted to himself that he could no longer keep pretending this was temporary began like any other, with him standing in his kitchen staring into a cup of coffee gone cold while he thought about Mia and her mother. He had woken before dawn, uneasy and restless in a way he could not name, and he knew it was because he was tired of feeling like he was living half in one world and half in another. Every time he left their apartment, he carried the same dull ache of unfinished purpose with him. He would walk into his pristine penthouse, place his keys on the marble counter, and feel the silence close around him, like a door he could not open. That morning, as he set the untouched coffee aside, he knew he had reached a point where he either needed to step away and let them return to their own path, or make it clear that he was choosing something permanent. He realized with a clarity that shocked him that he didn't want to leave them. He had never wanted anything more than he wanted to belong in their lives without the caveat of only helping for a while. He arrived later than usual, weighed down by the decision he knew he was about to make. When Mia opened the door, her smile was bright and immediate, and it struck him how much she already expected him to be there. She no longer looked surprised to see him standing on the threshold. She looked relieved, as though some small part of her always worried that this would be the day he didn't come. He stepped inside, and before he could put the grocery bags down, she wrapped her arms around his waist, her head pressed against his stomach. He rested his hand lightly on her hair, feeling the softness of the curls he had come to recognize in a crowd. That simple gesture anchored him more than anything else could have. Mrs. Brown was sitting up in the armchair by the window, wearing a sweater that hung loosely on her narrow shoulders. She looked stronger than she had the first day he came, though still pale, and she smiled at him in that hesitant, grateful way that made him feel both humbled and protective. He set the bags on the table and took the chair across from her, studying her face for a moment in silence. She must have sensed that he was carrying something different today, because she folded her hands in her lap and waited without asking. He felt Mia slip into the seat beside him, her small hand curling around his fingers like she had been doing it all her life, and he took a slow breath to steady himself. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he began, and the truth of it filled every corner of his voice. "I came here at first because I thought it was the right thing to do, and because I couldn't stop thinking about that phone call." He looked down at Mia, who watched him with wide, wondering eyes, then back at Mrs. Brown. "But it's not only that anymore." He paused, searching for words he had never needed to use before. "I care about both of you. I care in a way that doesn't feel like something I can, or want to, walk away from." Mrs. Brown's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Mia leaned closer, as though trying to understand every word, her fingers tightening on his. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I don't know exactly what this looks like," he said, because he wouldn't insult them by pretending he had all the answers. "But I want to be here. Not as someone who just shows up with groceries or makes phone calls to doctors. I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." For a long moment, no one spoke. The old clock on the shelf ticked softly, counting out the seconds as Mrs. Brown's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "Ryan," she said finally, her voice trembling, "I don't even know what to say. No one has ever offered us something like that." He shook his head gently. "You don't have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know how I feel." Mia's voice, when it came, was so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Does that mean you could be our family?" The word landed between them with a weight that made his chest tighten. He turned to her and cupped her cheek in his palm. "If you'll have me," he said quietly, "I would be honored to be part of your family." Mrs. Brown lifted a hand to her mouth as a sob broke free, and Mia climbed into his lap without hesitation, wrapping her small arms around his neck. He held her carefully, feeling her warmth and the steady thud of her heart against his chest. And he thought that nothing in his life, not his wealth, not the reputation he had built, not the success he had believed mattered more than anything, could compare to the simple, shattering rightness of that moment. Later, when Mia had drifted to sleep against his shoulder, Mrs. Brown spoke again in a voice so raw it felt like confession. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this." He shook his head without looking away from the child he held. "It isn't something that needs repayment," he said. "I want this, all of it." She closed her eyes, and he saw the exhaustion in her finally ease, as though she had been carrying a burden alone for so long she had forgotten it was possible to set it down. That night, when he finally rose to leave, Mia stirred awake and lifted her head. She looked at him sleepily, her eyes bright in the dim light. "You'll come back tomorrow?" she asked. He bent and kissed her hair. "Tomorrow and every day after," he promised, feeling the truth of it root itself so deeply he knew it could never be undone. When he stepped out into the quiet hallway, he felt something inside him settle for the first time in years. He understood now that sometimes the life you thought you were building is only the shell of what you really need. And the real life, the one that matters, waits behind an unremarkable door with a little girl who believes you will keep your promises. I think this ending is quietly powerful because it doesn't rely on a dramatic rescue or a grand gesture to feel transformative. Instead, it's the accumulation of small, deeply human choices, showing up, listening, admitting vulnerability, that creates something lasting and real. What moves me most is that Ryan doesn't become a savior so much as he becomes willing to let go of his polished armor. He allows himself to be needed, and in doing so, he discovers that genuine connection matters more than any success he ever chased. The final image of him stepping into the hallway, knowing he has finally found a place where he belongs, feels honest and hopeful. It's not a fairy tale where every problem disappears overnight. It's a promise that love, imperfect, messy, and freely given, can become a foundation strong enough to hold a new family together. To me, that makes it the kind of ending that lingers long after you finish reading.